Hey, how's it going? You ever wondered about what sports we might be able to do in the future? Like, I don't know, anti-gravity racing, or skydiving from a space elevator, or whatever the equivalent of sky art will be. Maybe instead of a plane, it's a naked guy in zero gravity, and instead of smoke, it's some kind of horrifying bodily fluid situation. Well, today I'm talking about the far future sport ideas that I've had. Let's do it. Spaceships are kind of the archetypal futuristic thing, so probably the most obvious future sport would be racing spaceships against each other. Rocketry-based racing through a complex series of nearby gravity wells could be a really cool idea, since navigating a vehicle's trajectory through multi-body gravitational systems makes the best path to take kinda hard to know. Even just minimizing delta V using multi-burn impulsive trajectories needs you to have a huge amount of computing resources to figure that out properly. And a race isn't just a delta V minimizing problem, it's way more complicated than that. It's way more complicated than just a time minimization problem too, since minimizing delta V is still also going to be a part of it. You might assume, like I initially did, that at a certain level of tech development we could just point a ship where we want to go and travel in basically a straight line, optionally slowing down if you don't want to slam into the finish line at Mach 100. Which kind of reduces the whole race to which ship can accelerate faster, which makes the whole sport kind of boring. But there's a few problems with that thought. One, that does assume ludicrously advanced technology which may or may not ever become a thing. Two, space is curved by the gravity of whatever's in it, so strictly speaking a straight line isn't the fastest path anyway, there'll still be navigational challenges involved. And three, spacecraft design involves several major factors. There's thrust-to-weight ratio, there's ISP, there's form factor, there's power plant, there's cost. You could play with these constraints to make any different type of spaceship racing league that you like. We could have lots of different ones, as different from each other as NASCAR is from Formula 1 and as Formula 1 is from soapbox racing. You know, what if you get disqualified if your thrust exceeds a certain threshold? So now you've got to take a driftier, circuitous, navigationally more complex route. Or what if you have to keep the vehicle mass below a certain amount? Or what if you need to get there using only photon sails as your propulsion method? Or what if you take off all the other limits, but you have a biological pilot on board who you need to keep alive and not liquefy their spine with all the G-forces involved? What if you start in orbit of, or maybe even on the surface of, one of the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, and the exact location of the finish line is on another one of the moons, but it's randomly selected at the exact moment that the race starts, so you have to compute your route on the way. There's so many possibilities to this, and lots of them are really f***ing sick, and given the scope for ridiculously complicated computing systems and testing the limits of engineering technologies, you could probably get gigantic amounts of funding from, like, I don't know, space military contractors and shit, trying out new computing methods and cutting-edge materials and propulsion systems and cooling systems and thingamajigs and doohickeys and whatchamacallits. That's a really cool motorsport idea, but what sports can we do with feeble, squishy human bodies themselves? Well, if you had a big open area inside of a space station, you could probably come up with a variety of new sports. I mean, to be honest, you could basically play a space version of, like, football or volleyball or something. If you threw or kicked a ball, it would more or less keep going in a straight line, so I have to imagine it would be a pretty frantic, fast-paced kind of thing. I guess the goal would just be a big ring that you want to get the ball into. Now that I think about it, it'd sort of end up being like a cooler, less gay version of Quidditch. Also, it's pretty easy to get stranded in the middle of a space station if you don't have anything to hold onto. Trying to swim through the air is way less effective than you'd think it would be. So we might want to make the zero-G stadium less of a big open space and more of a space filled with a mesh of handrails or a web of interconnected ropes or something, so the game doesn't devolve into watching 20 dudes flail their arms hopelessly while gently rotating in the middle of a vast open area. Maybe we could make a series of transparent tubes the players could float through, like a fucking massive version of one of those wacky hamster enclosures. Then again, if there was some open space, but not too much, maybe you could get some fun out of people getting stuck and their teammates chancing it to try and rescue them by leaping at each other and either saving them or f***ing it up and also ending up stranded in the middle of nowhere. If you were doing something like this in low gravity rather than zero gravity, like you have a pressurized stadium on the moon or something, you could slightly more closely approximate an existing sport on Earth, although the ball would still be very light, so it would get absolutely sent across the stadium every time you kick it. Maybe space football might be some grand scale sport with like 100 players on each side, so you can justify having a stadium 10 times larger than normal, so the scale of the physics kind of behaves and makes more sense. Also, the players themselves would be very light, so they could leap into the air and intercept the ball a bit more easily, which would be cool. Actually, if you designed the stadium with curved walls, you could run up the walls and basically make Rocket League with hundreds of dudes scrambling up the walls and flinging themselves at the ball simultaneously, which sounds like it would be fucking hilarious to watch after a few pints. Something that might fuck with your ability to make sports work properly in low gravity is how it's not obvious what the optimal optimal form is for running as fast as possible. Like, when the Apollo astronauts went there, they were either cooped up in the lander, which was claustrophobic as shit, you could barely find the room to take a dump, much less break into a sprint, or they were outside wearing spacesuits, which were pressurized and fairly rigid, meaning the fastest way to travel across the surface was a kind of a bounding, skipping, frolicking, whatever the f you want to call this. Anyway, I look forward to us figuring out how to actually run over there. I'm trying to imagine how I walk when I'm stood up to my shoulders in a pool. Why do I feel like we're all going to have to adopt Andrew Tate's weird posture?
I like your Andrew Tate costume.
Don't fucking talk to me, idiot. What color's your Bugatti anyway?
Not the posture.
After Apollo 14, NASA astronauts got bored of having to do a kangaroo impression to get anywhere, so for Apollo 15, 16, and 17, they brought a rover with them. I always found that kind of logistically impressive. They were already maxing out their Delta V capability, and they effectively brought an entire car with them on top of that. That's like getting a Kia Picanto onto a Ryanair flight without the dude at the gate noticing your bag's gotten any bigger. No fucking idea how they managed that. I mean, I'm fairly sure it comes down to they just made it very light and folded it up, but I'm sure someone in the comments is going to tell me they won it in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel against the Anunnaki or some shit. Anyway, you could make some sick off-road courses on other planets and moons with some gigantic jumps, although we might want to make some actual roads if we're doing this on the moon, seeing as the tiny glass-like dust particles tend to shred stuff. Maybe on the moon we could make a sport out of cars made flimsy on purpose, driving on very narrow roads, so if you even go off the track a little bit, your car just turns into a pile of rubble and you'd probably die in one of like 40 different scientifically interesting ways. Another relatively obvious idea would be human-powered flight. This isn't viable on Earth or even on Mars really, but basically anywhere else we're ever likely to inhabit, such as the moon or even somewhere like Titan. The gravity is low enough where the thrust-to-weight ratio produced by a human being could be high enough to actually fly. You could make some shitty DIY wings and strap them to your arms and flap them as hard as you can. Or slightly more realistically, we might do something like air sailing or some kind of bicycle that generates lift when you pedal it. You could basically make those goofy old-timey flying machines, particularly if you could put something in the raw atmosphere of Titan, since the atmosphere is really dense, on top of it also being a low gravity place, it would be really easy to fly there. Although it is pretty cold there, you might want to bring a jacket. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this. Alright, thanks, back to the video. Interestingly enough, swimming would feel pretty much the same in low gravity as it does on Earth, although if you had a big tail fin you could get going fast enough to leap out of the water like a dolphin on human power alone. There's a whole video on this that I'll link in the description, but basically there's more options than you'd think there would be for low gravity pool related activities. If you had a pool situated on a moon base, you could possibly run along the surface of the water, so the Lunar Olympics could have the 100-meter Jesus Sprint, the Miracle Sprint event, brought to you by whichever religion decides to take credit for it this time. You could even leap high enough out of the water to make a sport out of leaping out of the water and landing on a diving board, which is fucking weird to think about. Also, I thought I'd throw in a couple of futuristic options for things that we could do on Earth. That way we have some cool futuristic sports to choose from, even if we Kessler syndrome ourselves onto the Earth permanently like a bunch of idiots. I've always thought that one of the coolest ideas for a motorsport would be like those Red Bull air races, but with ground effect vehicles, which are basically planes with stubby wings so they can only fly when they're really close to the ground because there's some goofy aerodynamic nonsense that happens, and TLDR, it basically creates an air cushion. Not really, it's more complicated, but who gives a shit. So you can design a vehicle to kind of need the ground effect in order to fly, so it stays low the whole time. To me, this always seemed like a scientifically plausible way to make a real-world equivalent of those anti-gravity racing games like Wipeout or F-Zero. Well, they'd look more like that, but it would probably behave slightly more like the pod racing in Star Wars. Now, you could make one of these vehicles, but just give it a big enough engine that it would eventually be able to get out of the ground effect region and just kind of fly in an unrestricted way, which kind of breaks the cool factor of having something skimming along the ground like a pod racer. Like, regardless of what shape you make the vehicle, you can always, in principle, give it a big enough engine to escape the ground effect. Because really, you can make anything fly if you throw it hard enough, but the solution to this is just to not give it too big of an engine. Between that and designing the aerodynamics properly, you could keep them close to the ground all, or at least a lot of the time. I mean, if we're really worried about them getting too high when we don't want them to, we could put a sensor on the bottom of them that just sends a signal to automatically disqualify a pilot that goes higher than like 20 meters off the ground or whatever. Or maybe the sensor triggers a system which doesn't allow you to pull the stick back any further if you reach a certain altitude cap. I'm sure after only 5 or 6 horrible deaths we could probably work out the right solution, but one problem with this whole idea is that you do need a pretty flat surface, so you need to hold the races either in the desert, or on the ocean, or on flat grassy plains, or maybe in the Arctic somewhere very big and open. Also, the turning radius on these things is not great, so the tracks are going to be pretty big. Hopefully the turning radius doesn't suck too much to make it not fun to watch, although a lot of that pod race from the Phantom Menace was pretty much in a straight line, and I don't know, that was still pretty cool to watch. Maybe we can just lean into the Wipeout thing and put missiles on them. No, that's a terrible idea. In fact, you could actually include jumps or sections of the track with some significant amount of camber to help the vehicles turn more tightly. I know that doesn't sound like it makes much sense given these things would essentially be flying in the first place, but if you had a ramp, they could ride the ground effect up the ramp, and then when they fly off the end of the ramp, suddenly the ground effect wouldn't be there and their altitude would want to lower again until they're in the ground effect region again. So again, it would kind of be like doing a jump in the Wipeout games where you're just at a higher altitude for a bit and then you snap back to the normal track altitude after a few seconds. And by the way, this isn't really the same thing, but there is already the E1 boat racing series, which definitely gives me Wipeout 2048 vibes, if that's something you're into. Also, you could add drone racing to this category of things kind of vaguely reminiscent of sci-fi anti-gravity racing. I'm also very much looking forward to anything even remotely resembling the hover cars from Jak 2, but again, I'm not really seeing how that's going to happen anytime soon. Zan, they're actually working on those. Yeah, they're shut the fuck up. Also, we can't close out this episode without mentioning the possibilities of virtual reality. VR basically makes any type of cockpit-based scenario plausible, even if we're simulating something that would never work in real life. So some kind of mech pilot gladiator league might be easier to do this way rather than literally building physical mechs. But also, different types of racing are a good application for this too. I was joking earlier, but we could put actual weapons on actual vehicles and have people actually drive them, but just drive them remotely in VR. So then we can have actual death races and blow them up or whatever with real cannons and missiles and shit. Also, if you want to have a sport where you run around doing stuff, if you could make a big physical space that mimics the topography of a much more interesting and grandiose looking space that we could simulate, you could then have people wear VR headsets and sprint around an actual physical arena doing a sort of Hunger Games, PUBG, Battle Royale type thing. That'd be sick. I mean, it's basically a laser tag, except we can make it look more like an actual war zone. Also, I think we should maybe make the participants wear a vest that shocks them like a cattle prod when they get shot. That way we can instill real fear into the participants. But Zandros, what if the little kiddlywinks want to play? Good, they can learn what it means to suffer. Welcome to the real world, bitch. And by real world, I mean a fake world that electrocutes you. So hopefully some of these ideas are realized in the future. I can't go through another 1,000 years of regular football. Fucking kill me now. Anyway, when one of you creates a startup company doing anti-gravity racing or whatever, just remember to send a check in the mail to your ideas guy. Alright, as always, big thanks to my elite level supporters, Thunderbolt22A10, who won the Martian Squat Thrust League 8 years in a row, Nomad Greg, who's the Milky Way Galaxy's record holder for being the best at belting a beach ball up and down a corridor with a French loaf while riding a unicycle, Yannick Spade, who came 3,897th in the Intergalactic Pole Vaulting Championship. That's pretty good considering the number of sentient beings that participated. Andrew Mole, who can throw a shot put so powerfully it once caused a rift in time, allowing him to go back thousands of years and teach shot putting to ancient humanity, creating a time loop that kind of implies the universe itself invented the shot put if you really think about it. John Bejarano, who invented a new type of volleyball but won't tell any of us about it for fears it might open a portal to the volleyball dimension, and to all my other supporters too. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.